The napkin was already in his hand before Riley's brain caught up to what her body had done. 8 words that would either save a crime lord's life or end hers in the next 60 seconds. Damian Rourke's eyes didn't flicker as he read it, didn't betray a single emotion, but 3 feet behind him, his head of security was sweating through a 70-degree room and checking his phone like a man waiting for permission to pull the trigger. The betrayal was already in motion, the hit already purchased, and Riley had just inserted herself between a mafia boss and the bodyguard who'd sold him out for the price of erasing a gambling debt. Except nobody in this underground lounge knew she was the only reason Damian was still breathing. But before we go deeper into what happens when Damian reads that napkin, do me one favor. If you're invested in Riley's story and you want to see how a powerless bartender becomes something dangerous, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Comment where you're watching from so I know this story reached you. Let's build this community together. Sweat gathered at the small of Riley Monroe's back, soaking into the crisp white shirt beneath her black vest, mixing with the faint scent of the citrus perfume she'd applied 12 hours ago and the exhaustion she couldn't afford to show. She had been behind the bar for 14 straight hours, her hands moving through the choreography of shaking, stirring, pouring, and wiping with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed these motions so many times they no longer required conscious thought. She navigated the narrow corridor behind the bar, where bottles gleamed like jewels under recessed lighting, where men laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, where women whispered into phones while their companions weren't watching, where deals were sealed with a someone and lives were ended with a text message. Her wrists ached from the constant motion. Her feet screamed inside the required black leather flats. And the professional smile she had perfected over 6 years in the service industry felt more like a scar than an expression. But she could not stop. Not tonight. Not when her rent was 3 weeks overdue and her phone buzzed every morning with increasingly aggressive messages from her landlord. Each one a countdown to eviction, to the street, to losing the fragile foothold she'd clawed out in this unforgiving city. The main room of the Gilded Cage hummed with its usual Friday night frequency. Politicians who would condemn these very establishments on Monday sat in curved leather booths, their ties loosened, their principles even looser. Couples celebrated anniversaries while ignoring the blood money that paid for the champagne. Off-duty cops drank for free, their presence both protection and warning. Riley moves through all of it like water finding paths between stones. A cocktail tray balanced perfectly on her left hand, her steps silent on the polished concrete floor, her words calibrated to be heard but not remembered, her face arranged in an expression of attentive neutrality. She had learned the essential skill of her profession, how to become furniture that breathed, present when summoned, but invisible when inconvenient, watching everything while appearing to see nothing. Perhaps that was why she noticed him before anyone else did. Table 7, the corner booth reserved for those who didn't just pay for discretion, but demanded it, positioned where 3 walls created a natural fortress and the lighting could be controlled by a dimmer switch within arm's reach. Damian Rourke. She had served him 11 times over the past 8 months, always arriving at midnight exactly, always accompanied by his head of security, Kyle, always ordering a double whiskey neat, Macallan 25, never ice, never water, always tipping exactly 30% in crisp $100 bills, never raising his voice, never touching the servers, never causing visible trouble. Yet every employee understood that Damian Rourke's table operated under different rules than the rest of the lounge. Because when someone brought him the wrong whiskey or failed to refill his water glass without being asked, they didn't get written up or fired. They simply stopped showing up for their shifts, their lockers cleaned out by management, their phone calls unreturned, as if some invisible force had erased them from the schedule and everyone's memory without explanation. Riley had learned not to ask questions about men like Damian Rourke. In a city where the most powerful families built empires on things that could never appear in quarterly reports or shareholder meetings, survival meant keeping your observations locked behind your teeth and your curiosity buried under layers of willful ignorance. She knew he was important in the way that made police captains nervous and city councilmen obedient. knew the intricate tattoos that crawled up his neck and disappeared beneath his collar told stories written in violence and loyalty, knew the custom-tailored suits he wore cost more than she would earn in 2 years of six-day work weeks, knew that when he entered a room, conversations paused for precisely 3 seconds before resuming at a lower volume. And tonight, she knew something was catastrophically wrong. The first time Riley had served Damian Rourke had been a night in late March when the city above ground was finally beginning to thaw, though no trace of that seasonal change penetrated the permanent chill of the gilded cage. He had walked through the reinforced steel door at exactly midnight, neither announcing himself nor requiring announcement. Yet his arrival had rippled through the lounge like a stone dropped into still water. The door closed behind him with the pneumatic hiss of an airlock, sealing out the night, and every conversation in the VIP section had fractured for just a moment before stitching itself back together. Damian was not handsome in any conventional sense. His face held too much history, too many sharp angles carved by experiences that left permanent marks, with eyes so dark they appeared black in certain lighting. Not cold exactly, but penetrating in a way that made Riley feel as if he could read the contents of her bank account, her criminal record, and her private thoughts just by looking at her for 3 seconds. He stood well over 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, but moving with the controlled grace of someone who had trained his body to be both weapon and shield, wasting no motion, telegraphing no intent. No one had introduced him to Riley. No one needed to. Men like Damian didn't require introductions. They commanded recognition through sheer gravitational presence. He had sat at table 7, removed his black leather gloves with deliberate slowness, and had not opened the leather-bound menu. Riley had approached with a bottle of still water and a glass, following the protocol she'd been taught during her first week, though her pulse had accelerated noticeably that night, a primal response to proximity to something dangerous. "Good evening, McAllen 25. Neat? Or would you prefer to see the reserve list?" The question had left her mouth in the same calm, professional tone she used with every high-value customer, though she'd felt the distinct tightening of her throat that came from standing too close to a predator. Damian had lifted his gaze from the phone in his hand, and for a brief, eternal moment, his eyes had locked onto hers with an intensity that felt almost physical, like being pinned under a spotlight that revealed every flaw, every fear, every secret she thought she'd hidden successfully. Tonight, 8 months after that first encounter, Damian Rourke sat in his usual position at table 7, but Riley's trained eye caught the deviations immediately. The ritual had fractured. Kale, his head of security, a man built like a cement truck with the dead eyes of someone who had buried problems in shallow graves, stood 3 feet farther from the table than protocol dictated. His hand kept drifting to his phone, checking it with the nervous frequency of someone waiting for confirmation of something that couldn't be discussed openly. Most telling of all, a thin sheen of sweat glistened on his upper lip, despite the lounge's aggressive air conditioning, keeping the temperature at a constant 68 degrees. Riley noticed because noticing was the only skill that had kept her employed in places where powerful men conducted business they couldn't conduct in daylight. She noticed the way Kale's jaw clenched when another security team member approached. She noticed how his gaze kept flicking toward the service entrance, the one used by kitchen staff, and the one exit that didn't require passing through the main room's security checkpoint. She noticed the moment, precise and deliberate, when Kyle made eye contact with a man seated at table 12, a known enforcer for the Constantine family, Damian's primary rivals for control of the city's eastern territories. The enforcer gave the smallest nod imaginable. Kale's hand moved to his jacket pocket. Riley's blood turned to ice water. The realization assembled itself in her mind with horrifying clarity. Kale wasn't protecting Damian Rourke tonight. Kale was the weapon pointed at him. And judging by the enforcer's presence, by the way 3 unfamiliar faces had positioned themselves near the exits, by the way the usual Friday night crowd seemed slightly thinner than normal, the trigger was about to be pulled. She stood behind the bar, a cocktail shaker frozen in her grip, watching a murder assemble itself like pieces on a chessboard, and she understood with brutal certainty that she was the only person in the room who could see the pattern. Damian sat reviewing documents on his tablet, completely unaware that the man paid to take a bullet for him had already sold him to the highest bidder. The contract had been signed. the payment negotiated, and Damian Rourke himself was the currency. Riley's hands began to shake. Do nothing, the survival instinct whispered. You're a bartender. You mix drinks. You don't interrupt men who kill people for strategic reasons. You keep your head down, you collect your tips, you go home alive. But another voice, quieter and far more dangerous, asked a different question. How many more years are you going to spend invisible? How many more men are going to decide your value? How long are you going to let people like Kale, people who betray for money, who trade lives like stock options, control whether you may in fear or in power? The cocktail shaker trembled in her grip. She had perhaps 5 minutes before whatever signal Kale was waiting for would arrive. 5 minutes before the shooting started. 5 minutes to decide whether she remained furniture or became something else entirely. If you can't stand people like Kyle, traitors who sell out the people who trust them for a payday, type "loyalty matters" in the comments. Only snakes and backstabbers will scroll past this. Riley set down the cocktail shaker with hands that had steadied themselves through sheer force of will. She moved along the bar, wiping down surfaces that didn't need wiping, her eyes tracking the room's geometry with new purpose. The Constantine enforcer had ordered a second vodka tonic. Kale checked his phone again, the fourth time in 3 minutes. Another unfamiliar face, this one positioned near the main entrance, shifted his weight in a way that suggested he was carrying something heavy under his jacket. The pieces were all in position. They were just waiting for the signal to move. Riley's mind raced through scenarios, each one ending in blood on the polished concrete floor, police asking questions she couldn't answer, and her own name added to the long list of witnesses who knew too much and didn't survive long enough to testify. She could walk into the back, claim she felt sick, disappear into the women's bathroom and let whatever was going to happen simply happen. Damian Rourke was a crime lord. Men like him lived and died by the same violence they inflicted on others. Who was she to interrupt that natural cycle? The rationalization lasted exactly as long as it took for her to see Kyle lean slightly toward Damian, his hand moving inside his jacket with the casual motion of someone adjusting their holster. And she knew with the certainty of someone who had spent years reading body language and micro-expressions, that Kyle was about to execute his employer at point-blank range while making it look like he was reaching for his phone. She had 30 seconds, maybe less. Riley grabbed a napkin from the stack beside the garnish tray, snatched the pen she used to mark drink orders, and scrawled 8 words in handwriting made jagged by adrenaline and terror. Your fucking bodyguard sold you out. Don't turn around. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. This was insane. This was suicidal. This was the kind of decision that had got bartenders found in dumpsters with bullets in the back of their heads. But she was already moving, muscle memory taking over, her body executing the routine it had performed hundreds of times. Select the appropriate bottle and place it on a tray alongside a fresh glass. Approach the table with professional neutrality. She crossed the floor toward table 7, every step feeling like walking through deep water. Her peripheral vision tracking Kale's position, the enforcer's attention, the angle of the security camera above the bar. The room's ambient noise, laughter, music, the clink of glassware, became muffled, as if she were moving through a dream sequence where sound traveled through molasses. Damian didn't look up as she approached. He rarely did. To men like him, servers were animated furniture, functional and forgettable. Riley arrived at the table. Her voice emerged steady, professional, betraying nothing. You're Macallan 25, Mr. Rourke. Compliments of the house. She set down the glass with her right hand, positioned the bottle with practiced precision, and with her left hand, hidden from Kyle's line of sight by her body, she slid the folded napkin across the dark wood table, tucking it partially beneath the base of Damian's whiskey glass, where his hand would naturally find it. The entire transaction took 4 seconds. Damian's fingers brushed against the napkin as he reached for the glass. He paused, his hand stilled. And then, with the smallest possible motion, he unfolded the napkin while appearing to simply adjust his drink. Riley watched his eyes move across the 8 words she'd written. His expression didn't change. Not a single muscle twitched. but something in the air around him shifted, like the moment before a lightning strike when all the hair on your arms stands up in warning. His gaze lifted and met hers for exactly 2 seconds. In that brief connection, Riley saw a mind moving at computational speed, processing threat assessments, calculating betrayals, restructuring reality around this new information. Then his eyes released her, and she was dismissed with the same polite nod he gave every server who brought him his drink. But Riley knew she had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had inserted herself into a war she didn't understand, chosen a side in a conflict where neutrality was the only safe position, and gambled her life on the hope that Damian Rourke valued the warning more than he resented the intrusion. She turned and walked back toward the bar, her legs somehow still functioning, despite feeling like they'd been replaced with something that barely remembered how to support weight. Behind her, she heard Damian's chair scrape slightly against the floor, heard his voice, calm and measured, say something to Kyle about needing to take a call in private. The trap had been sprung, but not the one KL had built. If you believe people who work for a living, people like Riley, who serve the powerful while staying invisible, deserve to take up space and be heard, hit that subscribe button. Only people who think servers should stay silent and powerless will skip this. Riley's hands moved on autopilot as she returned to the bar, picking up a cloth that didn't need to be used, wiping down a surface already clean, anything to keep her body occupied while her mind screamed at volumes that should have shattered glass. The napkin was in Damian's hands now. The words were in his head. There was no unsending it, no walking it back, no pretending she had simply delivered a drink and moved on with her shift like every other night for the past 6 years. She had just told one of the most dangerous men in the city that his own bodyguard was about to kill him. She had crossed the fundamental line that kept people like her breathing. She had stopped being invisible. She had inserted herself into the machinery of violence that ground through this city like a meat processor, and now she was caught in the gears with no idea whether they would spit her out or pull her deeper. Her peripheral vision tracked movement at table 7. Damian set down his glass with the same controlled motion he used for everything. No sudden movements, nothing that would signal alarm or awareness. He reached into his jacket pocket, the motion so casual it could have been checking for his phone, and withdrew nothing, his hand returning empty to the table. But Riley saw the micro-adjustment in his posture, the way his shoulders shifted back by perhaps an inch, the way his head tilted at a fractionally different angle that gave him a wider sightline of the room without appearing to scan for threats. Kale stood exactly where he'd been standing for the past 10 minutes, his hands still resting near his jacket, his jaw still clenched, his attention still fragmenting between his phone and the Constantine enforcer at table 12. He hadn't noticed the napkin, hadn't seen the exchange. As far as Kyle knew, his trap was still perfectly constructed, invisible, ready to snap closed the moment he received the final signal. Damian lifted his glass and took a slow sip of whiskey, his eyes never leaving the tablet in front of him. To anyone watching, he was simply a businessman reviewing contracts over an evening drink, protected by competent security, operating under the assumption that his world was stable and predictable. But Riley knew better now. She had learned to read the room at a level most people never accessed, to see the patterns beneath the performance. And what she saw in Damian's manufactured calm was a predator who had just realized he was being hunted and was now calculating the most efficient way to reverse the equation. He reached for the napkin, the same napkin she'd written on, and used it to dab the corner of his mouth with deliberate slowness before setting it down on the table. The message had been received. The warning had been processed. Whatever happened next would happen because Riley Monroe had made a choice that couldn't be unmade, and the consequences were already in motion whether she was ready for them or not. Damian's phone vibrated against the table with timing so perfect it could have been choreographed. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting into something that approximated concern. Not panic, never panic, but the controlled frown of a man receiving news that required immediate attention. He pressed the phone to his ear without actually answering it, his lips moving in a one-sided conversation with no one, his free hand gesturing slightly as if responding to information only he could hear. Riley watched from behind the bar, her chest tight, her breathing shallow, as Damian stood with the fluid economy of motion that made expensive suits look even more expensive. He said something to Cale, too quiet for Riley to hear across the room, and gestured toward the back of the lounge with the phone still pressed to his ear. Not toward the main entrance where his car would be waiting, where the valet would have his keys ready, where the security protocol dictated he should exit. Toward the service corridor, toward the kitchen, toward the exit that staff used to haul trash and receive deliveries, the exit that wasn't monitored by his security team because it was supposed to be irrelevant to his movements. Cale's face transformed in the span of a single heartbeat. The professional mask he'd been wearing, the mask of competent security, of loyal protection, of controlled vigilance, fractured into something raw and primal. His hand moved toward his jacket, not casually this time, but with purpose, with urgency, with the desperation of someone watching a carefully constructed plan collapse in real time. His eyes cut to the Constantine enforcer at table 12, a look that screamed, "Abort, abort. The target is moving. The geometry is wrong. The trap won't work if he doesn't exit through the main doors." The enforcer's expression mirrored Kyle's panic. Both men suddenly aware that their choreographed assassination had lost its principal dancer, and the entire performance was falling apart. Damian moved toward the service corridor with unhurried confidence, still holding the phone to his ear, still projecting the image of a man handling business rather than fleeing an ambush. He didn't run, didn't rush, didn't signal awareness of the threat. He simply altered his trajectory with the kind of strategic improvisation that separated men who built empires from men who died trying. Kyle followed, his protocol instincts warring with his conspiracy obligations, his body caught between maintaining his cover as loyal security and his need to salvage the hit. His hand remained inside his jacket, gripping something Riley couldn't see but could imagine with horrifying clarity. The enforcer rose from table 12, abandoning subtlety, his own hand moving beneath his coat. Riley's hands gripped the edge of the bar, her knuckles white, her breath trapped somewhere between her lungs and her throat. Relief flooded through her. He got the warning. He's moving. He's alive. But it tangled immediately with a terror so profound it felt like drowning, because Damian Rourke had just publicly deviated from protocol based on information only she had provided. And everyone in this room who understood the language of violence would now be asking themselves the same question. Who warned him? Management shut down the Gilded Cage 40 minutes later with the kind of efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time the lounge had closed early due to unforeseen circumstances. The lights came up to full brightness, destroying the carefully cultivated atmosphere of shadows and secrecy, making everyone look older and more tired and more human than they appeared under the amber glow of strategic lighting. Customers were politely but firmly ushered toward the exits by security staff who suddenly appeared in greater numbers than Riley had seen during her entire employment. No explanations were offered. No questions were entertained. The message was clear. Leave now, forget what you saw, and consider yourself fortunate to be walking out under your own power. Riley collected her tips with trembling hands, $340 in wrinkled bills that felt meaningless now, currency from a world that had stopped. Mattering the moment that she'd written 8 words on a cocktail napkin, she changed out of her work vest in the employee locker room, pulling on her jacket with mechanical motions, while her mind spun through scenarios that all ended with her body being discovered in places bodies were routinely discovered in this city. The other bartender, Marcus, asked if she was okay. She told him she was fine. He didn't believe her, but he also didn't press, because people who worked at the Gilded Cage understood that curiosity was a luxury that shortened lifespans. The November air hit her like a physical assault the moment she stepped onto the street 3 floors above the lounge. The city had transformed while she'd been underground, a thin layer of snow covering the sidewalks and turning the streetlights into halos of diffused gold. Her breath formed clouds that dissipated into the darkness as she walked, her footsteps crunching against the fresh snow with sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the late-night quiet. The streets were nearly empty at this hour, just the occasional taxi sliding past, and the distant wail of sirens that formed the permanent soundtrack of urban existence. Riley pulled her jacket tighter and started the 12-block walk to her apartment. Unable to afford the luxury of a cab, her usual route taking her through streets she'd walked 1,000 times before, but which now felt alien and hostile. Every shadow held potential threats. Every parked car could contain someone waiting. Every sound, a door closing, footsteps echoing, the scrape of metal on concrete, sent adrenaline spiking through her system. She made it 4 blocks before she noticed the black sedan. It appeared in her peripheral vision first, sliding along the street parallel to her route, its headlights off, its engine a low purr that barely registered above the ambient city noise. Riley told herself it was nothing, just another car, just paranoia amplifying normal activity into threat assessment. But then she turned left at the next intersection, and 2 blocks later, the sedan turned left as well, maintaining the same distance, the same speed, the same predatory patience of something tracking prey that didn't yet realize it was being hunted. The sedan accelerated with sudden purpose, pulling alongside her with the smooth precision of a vehicle designed for exactly this kind of interception. Riley's body tensed for violence, for the window to roll down and a gun to emerge, for the finale to her brief and stupid heroism to arrive in the form of a bullet she'd never see coming. Instead, the rear door opened from the inside, and a woman's voice cut through the November air with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "Get in, now. You have approximately 90 seconds before the Constantine cleanup crew arrives at this intersection." Riley's survival instincts screamed conflicting instructions. Run, comply, fight, freeze. But her legs made the decision before her brain could process the variables. She dove into the sedan's leather interior, the door slamming shut behind her with the heavy thunk of reinforced metal, and the vehicle was moving before she'd fully registered what she'd done. The woman beside her in the back seat was maybe 40, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Riley's annual rent, with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that assessed Riley the way the jeweler might examine a stone of uncertain value. "Silas," the woman said, offering no hand to shake, no pleasantries to soften the abduction. "I handle problems for Mr. Rourke. Tonight you became both a problem and a solution, which makes this conversation complicated." Riley's mouth had gone dry, her voice emerging as something between a whisper and a croak. "Where are you taking me?" "Somewhere the Constantines can't follow. Somewhere you can explain to Mr. Rourke exactly how you identified a threat his entire security apparatus missed." Silas's expression remained neutral, but something that might have been respect flickered across her features. "Or somewhere you can collect a substantial payment for your silence and disappear into a city where your name will be forgotten by Monday morning. Your choice." The sedan climbed through increasingly expensive neighborhoods, the snow-covered streets growing wider and quieter until they pulled into an underground garage beneath a glass tower that screamed wealth in every architectural detail. Riley was escorted through security checkpoints, staffed by men who looked at Silas with the deference usually reserved for generals, then into an elevator that required a keycard and a fingerprint scan to access the penthouse floors. The doors opened onto a space that could have been featured in magazines about how billionaires lived when they weren't pretending to be relatable. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city like a control room monitoring an empire. Minimalist furniture that probably cost more than cars. Art that Riley suspected was either priceless or very good forgeries. And standing near the windows with a fresh glass of whiskey in his hand, his suit jacket removed to reveal the full intricate artwork of tattoos crawling up both arms and disappearing beneath his collar, was Damian Rourke. He turned as Riley entered, and for the first time since she'd started serving him 8 months ago, he looked at her not as furniture or staff or background decoration, but as a person whose existence had altered the trajectory of his survival. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice carrying the same controlled intensity she'd heard him use when negotiating deals she wasn't supposed to overhear. "You saved my life tonight. Now we need to discuss what that means for yours." The conversation lasted 23 minutes, though it felt simultaneously like hours and seconds, time behaving strangely under the weight of decisions that would reshape the architecture of Riley's entire existence. Damian explained the betrayal with the clinical precision of someone conducting an autopsy on trust. Cale had been compromised 6 weeks ago, his gambling debts weaponized by the Constantine family, His loyalty purchased for the price of erasing what he owed, plus a payment substantial enough to relocate to a country without extradition treaties. The hit had been scheduled for tonight because a shipment worth $8 million was changing hands tomorrow. And without Damian's signature, the transfer would default to his second-in-command, who was already on the Constantine payroll. You read a room better than people I pay six figures annually to do the same job, Damian said, swirling the whiskey in his glass with motions that looked meditative, but Riley suspected were purely tactical, a way of controlling the pace of conversation. You saw what KL was doing before he did it. That's not luck. That's not a coincidence. That's a skill I can't teach and can't buy, which makes it rare enough to be valuable. The offer was simple in structure, devastating in implication. Riley could take $50,000 in cash, leave the city by Monday, and live whatever life she wanted in whatever place she chose, with the understanding that her name would be erased from every record connected to tonight, and she would never speak of what she'd witnessed. Or she could accept a position in Damian's organization, starting with an intensive training that would transform her observational skills into operational assets, with compensation that would make her bartending salary look like pocket change, and protection that would make her untouchable in a city where violence was currency. Riley thought about the 12-block walk through snow to an apartment she could barely afford, thought about 6 years of invisible servitude, of men looking through her while she memorized their secrets, of tips that determined whether she ate more than ramen that week, thought about Kyle, who had traded loyalty for money and would now spend whatever time he had left running from the consequences. And she thought about the moment Damian had looked at her, really looked at her, as if she were a person whose thoughts and choices in existence had weight and value and impact. "I accept," she said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "The second option, I accept." Damian nodded once, a gesture that contained no surprise, as if he'd already known which choice she would make before she'd articulated it. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small black box, opening it to reveal a platinum pin shaped like a key, its surface etched with symbols Riley didn't recognize, but suspected carried meaning to those who needed to understand such things. "This marks you as under my protection," he said, placing it in her palm where it settled with surprising weight for something so small. "Anyone in this city who sees this and understands what it represents will know that harming you means answering to me. Wear it visibly. It's not decoration, it's a declaration. If you believe people deserve the chance to escape systems designed to keep them powerless, and you can't stand manipulators like KL who sell out the people who trust them, hit that like button. Only cowards and traitors will scroll past this moment." The pin felt warm against her skin as she attached it to her jacket collar, its weight somehow grounding her to this new reality. Silas drove her home as dawn began breaking over the city, the streets slowly filling with the early commuters who had no idea the night's violence had been narrowly avoided. Riley climbed the stairs to her apartment with legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Someone who had made decisions that couldn't be unmade and accepted consequences that hadn't fully materialized yet. She returned to the world 3 days later after spending 72 hours in her apartment processing what she'd done, and the shift was immediate and undeniable. The bouncer at the club she passed on her way to buy coffee, a man who'd ignored her existence for 2 years, stepped aside and nodded with something that looked like respect. The police officer writing a parking ticket glanced at her collar, saw the pin, and his expression shifted from neutral authority to cautious deference. The barista, who usually treated her like an inconvenience, smiled with genuine warmth and refused to accept payment for her order. The training began on a Monday morning in a warehouse facility that didn't appear on any city maps. Access through a loading dock that required 3 separate security clearances and a retinal scan. Riley had expected something from action movies, shooting ranges and punching bags and tactical obstacle courses. What she got instead was far more brutal in its psychological precision. The first week broke down everything she thought she understood about survival. A former intelligence operative named Kovac taught her how to read micro-expressions, the involuntary facial movements that lasted less than a second but revealed genuine emotion beneath practiced lies. A chemist with a background Riley suspected involved government agencies that officially didn't exist walked her through compounds that could incapacitate, disorient, or kill, depending on dosage and delivery method. All of them odorless and virtually undetectable in drinks she could mix in under 10 seconds. A cryptographer taught her the syntax of coded language, how information moved through seemingly innocent conversations when every third word mattered and the rest was camouflage. But it was Damian who pushed her past the limits she'd built around herself over 6 years of diminishing expectations and survival mode thinking. He appeared without schedule or warning, disrupting whatever lesson she was absorbing to ask questions that felt like scalpels. Why are you waiting for permission to speak? You're not serving drinks anymore. You're making decisions that will keep people alive or get them killed. Which one matters more, being polite or being right? The simulation happened 3 weeks into training with Mom, designed to test whether Riley could identify and neutralize a threat in real time without backup or clear instructions. She entered a mock nightclub populated by actors playing various roles: patrons, staff, security, targets. Somewhere in the chaos was a planned assassination she needed to prevent using only observation and improvisation. No weapons, no communication devices, just her instincts and whatever resources the environment provided. She failed spectacularly on the first attempt, missing the obvious tell that the bartender was the assassin because she'd been trained to trust people in service positions, to identify with them, to see them as allies rather than threats. The simulation ended with the target dead and Riley standing in the middle of the mock club feeling the weight of failure in every muscle. Damian appeared beside her in the aftermath, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You're still thinking like someone who reacts to what others initiate. Servers wait for orders. Leaders create the conditions that force others to react to them. Run it again. This time, don't watch the room. Control it. The second attempt felt different from the moment Riley walked through the door. She didn't scan for threats. She became one, approaching the bar not as a customer, but as someone who belonged there, who had authority there, slipping behind the counter with confidence that made the actor playing the bartender hesitate. She grabbed a bottle of premium vodka and a shaker, started mixing a drink nobody ordered, and while her hands performed the familiar choreography of her old profession, her eyes tracked every person in the room with the predatory focus of someone hunting rather than hiding. She spotted the real tell within 90 seconds. The security guard whose attention kept drifting to his watch, syncing his timing with someone else's schedule. Riley walked over with the drink she'd mixed, handed it to him with a smile, and said loud enough for nearby patrons to hear, "Compliments of management for the new guy. House tradition." He accepted it reflexively, drank it without thinking, and 30 seconds later was stumbling toward the bathroom as the harmless but aggressive diuretic she'd added to the vodka took effect. His carefully planned timeline completely destroyed. Damian watched from the observation booth above, and when Riley looked up, he raised his glass in silent acknowledgement. She wasn't a server anymore. She was something far more dangerous. The Paramount Hotel ballroom carried the same oppressive elegance as the Gilded Cage, though this version existed above ground where chandeliers caught natural light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows, and the city's elite pretended their wealth came from legitimate sources. Riley stood near the bar, not behind it, not serving it, but beside it, wearing a black dress that cost more than 3 months of her old rent and holding a champagne flute she had no intention of drinking. The platinum pin glinted at her shoulder, catching light and attention in equal measure. 6 months had passed since the night she'd scribbled a warning on a napkin. 6 months of training that had stripped away the reflexive deference she'd cultivated over years of survival, replacing it with something harder and infinitely more useful. She moved through the gala as Damian's associate, introduced to politicians and business owners and people whose names appeared in newspapers beside words like philanthropist and civic leader, while everyone in the room understood the real source of their influence. Damian stood 15 feet away, engaged in conversation with the city's deputy mayor, his posture relaxed but his attention fragmented in the way Riley had learned to recognize. He was tracking multiple threads simultaneously: the conversation, the room's energy, the positioning of his security detail, the subtle currents of power that flowed through gatherings like this, where deals were negotiated in euphemisms and threats were delivered through polite suggestions. Riley's attention snagged on a detail Damian's new security team had missed entirely. The server approaching from the kitchen corridor moved with the wrong rhythm, his steps slightly too measured, his tray positioned at an angle that prioritized concealment over balance. She'd spent 6 years perfecting the choreography of serving, knew the muscle memory, the efficiency of motion, the way experienced staff moved through crowded rooms with unconscious grace. This man was performing service, not living it. Her eyes tracked his trajectory toward Damian, calculated the intersection point, noted the way his right hand remained suspiciously still while his left adjusted the tray. She had perhaps 20 seconds before he reached striking distance. Riley closed the gap with smooth confidence, intercepting the server 3 steps before he reached Damian's position. She smiled with warmth that never touched her eyes and spoke just loud enough for him to hear, her voice carrying the casual authority of someone who belonged in spaces like this. Kovac sends his regards. He wanted me to tell you the Constantine contract was voided last week. You're working for a ghost, and everyone in this room knows it. The exits are being watched. You have one chance to set down that tray, walk out the service entrance, and disappear before people who are significantly less polite than me ask you questions you won't enjoy answering. The server's face drained of color as he processed the implications. That his employer no longer existed, that the woman speaking had access to intelligence he thought was secure, that the setup he'd been promised was actually a trap. His hand moved away from whatever weapon he'd concealed beneath the tray, and he turned without a word, walking toward the service corridor with the defeated posture of someone whose carefully constructed plan had just collapsed. Riley returned to her position near the bar, took a sip of champagne she still didn't taste, and felt Damian's gaze find her across the room. He didn't smile. Damian rarely smiled in public, but something in his expression shifted, a recognition that transcended words. She had just neutralized a threat his entire security apparatus had missed, using nothing but observation and the credibility her position provided. She was no longer the bartender who watched powerful men make decisions. She was no longer the invisible furniture that absorbed secrets while polishing glass. She was no longer the payment in someone else's negotiation. Riley Monroe had become the person who walked into rooms and made powerful men reconsider their strategies, who controlled the flow of violence through whispered words rather than raised weapons, who collected debts rather than tips. The city's underground would learn her name eventually, some already had, and those who understood what the platinum pin represented knew that the woman wearing it had transformed from someone who served power into someone who wielded it with precision, sharp enough to cut through any threat that dared to test her. If this story moved you, if you believe people like Riley deserve to rise above the systems designed to keep them invisible, and you can't stand exploiters who treat human beings like disposable furniture, hit that subscribe button right now. Share this story so others can see what's possible when someone refuses to stay small. Only those who profit from keeping others powerless will walk away without subscribing. Don't be one of them.